Welcome to Cultured, the podcast about everything fermenting with your host, Natalie Marin. Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Cultured, the podcast about all things fermenting. And today we're actually going to be discussing recipes and a recipe on how to take this. Okay, so you know what this is? This is a ginger bug. So we're going to take this rather lively ginger bug, and we're going to be discussing how to turn it into this, an artisanal bread. Now, when you think of baking bread, you don't think of using a ginger bug. You would think of using yeast or a sourdough starter. And I've been there over the years. I've done the sourdough thing, but I've always struggled to keep and maintain my starter simply because of where I live in the world. Your ferments are always very much affected by your environment, and that is something a lot of people aren't aware of. When you are looking at creating a fermentation, try to find someone to learn from who has a similar climate to where you are based. So very cold climates to very warm climates will take different approaches to fermenting. I live in a subtropical climate, so it's very humid and it's very hot. And with that also comes a lot of struggles. Like we would have insects and bugs year round. There's no cold winter where things like fruit flies die off, unfortunately. So it's a year-round struggle. We also do struggle a lot more with mold. Mold does occur much more easily. And that is my biggest struggle when creating sourdough. I have done it successfully for months on end, and then I've just gone for periods, where every single starter I get is just taken out by mold, and it gets incredibly frustrating. My quest then became how to be able to have a yeast, a homemade yeast specifically. I don't want to be buying shop bought yeasts, but I want a homemade yeast that can live for a long time, that is not susceptible or as susceptible to molds, and I can use it to bake breads as well as many other things. And this is where I decided to start experimenting with my ginger bug. I have created a previous video on how to go about creating ginger and turmeric bugs, and I will include those links for you in the description if you want to go and check those out. And I've also created a video on how to use your ginger bug to create wild sodas, so I will include that in the description for you as well. When I originally started the ginger bug, it was specifically for sodas, especially lemonade, because lemonade is just one of my absolutely favorite probiotic packed drinks, and that will be the link that I'll be sharing with you. You can go and check out how to make that lemonade using your ginger bug. But this ginger bug I have specifically created to make bread. And I have been working endlessly to try and figure out the best way to make bread using your ginger bug and to overcome any obstacles that one might experience in the process. And with that being said, I'm going to go through how I've got from this to making a beautiful bread that looks like this. I do feel though that my bread isn't quite yet perfect. It's still a little bit on the dense side, and I'm busy working on a few things to make that better. But it is a beautiful loaf, it is a good bread, and it's most definitely an edible bread, so there's no issues with any of that. But I will mention how I'm planning on experimenting further to improve that. And if you have any recommendations for me on how to improve my recipe for a light, fluffy bread, I will definitely look at considering those and taking those into consideration. So step number one is obviously to create your ginger bug. Once you have your bug going, you've got to wait for it to be lively. I mean, extremely lively, because that's when the yeasts are the most active, just like you would with a sourdough starter. When your sourdough starter is the most active, that is when you want to be baking with it. And the ginger bug is no different. When it's at its absolute most lively, that is when you want to be baking with it. So make sure you have one very, very, very lively ginger bug starter or turmeric bug starter. The reason why I did the specific experiment with ginger is because ginger is obviously well known to have a high natural yeast on its skin. So when you make your bug, you do want to make sure you're including the skins of the ginger, and you will know you're getting the most amount of yeast for your ginger bug. So what I do is the day before I feed it, I know that it is fed, just like you would feed your sourdough starter. And then the day comes when I am ready to use it. The first thing I do is I always make my bread dough in the evening before going to bed, because the first proofing is going to be overnight, and that's just where we're going to let it to start ferment with the flour and to start to rise at that point. And I've discovered that 12 hours is a really good time window to allow for that first initial fermentation / proofing stage. So I try to leave for up to 12 hours, not more. I've gone accidentally over and I've had very overproofed bread, which wasn't great. Minimum, I'd say 10 hours, but say 10 to 12 hours is when you want to be having your bread sitting in its first proof. The recipe, I'll include this in the description as well. So the recipe is very easy. 3 cups of flour of choice. I just use normal all-purpose flour. So 3 cups of flour to 1.5 cups of active yeast. So I have a wonderful KitchenAid, which I love. I'm not sponsored by KitchenAid, but I wouldn't say no to a sponsorship, that's for sure. But I absolutely love my KitchenAid mixer. So in there goes my 3 cups of flour, and I make sure to put my bread mixer on there for that initial dough mix. And then I add a teaspoon of sugar. So why would I add a teaspoon of sugar? After my first couple of flops, I kind of had the realization that you are taking your ginger bug, which is initially fed sugar, water, and ginger. So the yeast's primary food source is sugar. And now you're taking that yeast and you're putting it in a completely different environment with a completely different food source, and you're kind of going, eat it and survive. Obviously, there may be some troubles with that transition for your yeast, which is why I always add a teaspoon of sugar to the dough. Yes, this does make it a slightly and only slightly sweetened bread, but at the same time, you're also giving your yeast the best opportunity to adapt to its new environment just by adding that teaspoon of sugar. So 3 cups of flour, a teaspoon of sugar, then I mix it, and then I add in my 1.5 cups of starter liquid, and I'll mix it thoroughly. It will be a slightly sticky dough, which is what you want. If it's too dry, it's going to be very dense. So you want it to be a slightly moist, sticky dough. So if you poke it with your finger and you pull your finger away, the dough should stick to your finger. Not liquid, just sticky. But if you poke the dough and your finger comes away clean, maybe add a little bit more moisture just to make sure it's a good sticky dough. I then place it in a proofing bowl covered with plastic so it doesn't dry out, and I put it somewhere in a warm spot, usually in my microwave with the door open so the light is on, and then that light keeps my dough nice and warm. If you do your proofing in your oven with your oven light on, you can do that, or maybe just somewhere that's warm, but preferably no direct sunlight, because obviously sunlight could potentially kill off the whole fermentation process that's going on. You just want it to be somewhere where it's going to be really warm, and it's going to be in that spot undisturbed for 10 to 12 hours. When you have waited the full proofing time, you should open and you'll have a beautiful dough. It will noticeably have risen, and it will still be quite sticky. It won't be like a perfect round ball just yet. And this is where you're going to start with your stretch and folds. So the first thing you're going to do after your 10 to 12 hours is you're then going to do a stretch and fold. So you're just going to grab a side of the dough and stretch it and fold it over, grab and stretch and fold, and grab and stretch and fold. When I do my next dough, I should probably do a full video of how I go about and do it, but there are plenty of videos on the internet on how to stretch and fold sourdough, though there are also a lot of different versions on how to go about doing it. So you do whichever way you like to do it. It is recommended you do up to 8 stretch and fold. So you just grab the corners and you just keep on stretching the dough and folding it over itself. Stretch the dough and fold it over itself, and you do that 8 times, and then you leave the dough in its bowl that it was in, and you cover it with a cloth now, because now you want it to dry a little bit and to also get a little bit of exposure to the air. You cover it with a cloth and you put it back in its warm spot for another hour. And after an hour, don't wait more than an hour. If your time is a bit short or you're not sure, you know, but if you have to leave it, rather leave it for less than an hour. Rather do your stretch and folds every half an hour to an hour than less than half an hour more than an hour, if that makes sense. If you have any questions, just ask in the comments below. So in that time period between half an hour to an hour, you want to do another set of stretch and folds, and then you do it again and you stretch and fold. You have your seam where you've been doing the stretch and fold on top, and then you roll your dough over so the stretch and fold is at the bottom, and then you put it back in its warm spot to continue to rise. And you do that 4 times. You do the stretch and fold 4 times, and the reason why after the stretch and fold you roll your dough over and you put it back in the bowl is so that the next time you come around you do stretch and fold is going to be on the opposite direction. And what that does is it allows these air bubbles that you make to form throughout the bread. And that's what the main role of the stretch and fold is to not only change the wheat protein, but to also create these beautiful bubbles. And if you just do it on the same side over and over, you're going to have a lot of bubbles on the top of your bread and a very dense loaf at the bottom of your bread. So you want to make sure to roll over your dough every time after you've done a stretch and fold. Then once you have done that and you've done it, let's say for the 4th time, you're going to now go into shaping. So the shaping is the same thing, except you're going to take your dough out of its bowl now and you're going to put it on a lightly floured surface, and you're going to do just a few stretch and folds. You'll actually see when you get to this point that the dough doesn't stretch as far anymore, and it would have noticeably risen even further. So those 2 things are very important. It must have a noticeable rise from the first stretch and fold to the last stretch and fold, and it must also noticeably go less far, you know, without, because when you pull your dough it's going to start breaking, and by that last time, by the time you get to shaping, you shouldn't be able to pull your dough very far before you start to see like the dough start to break apart. In initial stretch and fold you'd be able to go quite far, but in this one, in that final one, you'll see you can only go very short and do small stretch and folds. So you do that final stretch and fold and on a powdered surface, and then in a bowl with a cloth and a lot of flour on that cloth. So you want to make sure that in the bowl there's a cloth and a lot of flour on that cloth. You're then going to now place that dough in that bowl and you're going to leave it for its final proofing. Let's go over final proofing quickly. So final proofing is where you're literally just letting your dough rise before baking. It's going to be its final last rise. There's a few things that should be noticeable. Is now that you've done all the stretch and folds and you've worked the gluten in the dough, it shouldn't be losing its shape too much. It might still spread out a bit, but the dough should be rising up more and going out a little bit. It shouldn't be just falling flat anymore. The ball of dough should be holding its form by the time you get to this stage. Depending on how well it's doing and how much time you have, you can decide on what proofing you want to do. I normally do at least a minimum of a 1 hour proof. So in the floured bowl, I've placed the dough in the floured bowl and I've let it sit for at least an hour. And this final proof you can do up to 3 hours in the warm spot. I don't recommend going further than that. If you don't have that time, you can do your final proofing in the fridge. That's something I haven't tried just yet. I normally just do it in the bowl for at least an hour. So between 1 to 2 hours is my average, and I let it rise, and up to 3 hours. Okay, so this is what I use. It's literally a pot, and I use it as a makeshift Dutch oven, and it fits perfectly in my little oven. So what I do is I just oil it lightly, and the reason for oiling it lightly, quite simply, is just to make sure my dough doesn't stick. So just a very light coating oil, and I put this in my oven to preheat, and I preheat my oven at 180 degrees Celsius, which is 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And so I preheat my oven, and then when my dough is done, I take it out of the bowl with the flour. So remember, it's down in a bowl of flour, and I take it and I turn it over and I put it in this makeshift Dutch oven with a very floury side on top, and then I cut it. So this is when you can cut your little design on the top of the bread, which also allows it to expand through that crack instead of just explode in an ugly sideways mess. So I put it in here, and then I pop it in my oven closed with the lid on. So with the lid on, and I do the initial bake for 20 minutes, and this just allows for the steam in the bread to do what it needs to do. I also sometimes add a bit of water to my oven to make it a very humid environment, and that does help. And then after 20 minutes, I take the lid off and I bake it for another 20 to 25 minutes until a beautiful golden brown. So that's how I bake my bread, and I leave it to cool before cutting it open. So that is the basics of how I take this ginger bug, and I've converted several sourdough recipes, and I've taken them and I've absorbed them into making a recipe that really works for making bread, and you can get a beautiful loaf of bread. So one of the things I'm going to be doing to try and make an even lighter and fluffier loaf of bread is I'm going to make my oven hot. I'm going to take it up to about 200 degrees which Celsius, which is about 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to give it a try and see how that impacts my bread. And I'm also going to let my ginger bug mature. So this loaf that you're looking at now is on a ginger bug that matured after 3 days. What I did was I created a couple of ginger bugs. I have 6 or 7 at the moment, and I split one to create a cheat bug, and that just saves you the full week of waiting to catch all your yeasts. I will also leave the link to that cheat bug video in the description for you to have a look. So it comes in really handy if you want to create more bugs. That will allow you to be able to do a lot more baking. It's a really good trick for that. But if you split it, of course, your ginger bug will be ready within 3 days. My concern, even though it has worked and it hasn't given me any problems, my concern there is the maturity of the yeast in the bug. What I'm going to be doing with my next batch is I'm going to be making sure my bug is at least a week old, active, but a week old. And then once it is at least a week old, I'm going to be using that. I'm going to be creating a much more hotter oven. Join me and follow me and see how that comes out, because I'm quite keen to see how it actually affects the bread. I'm hoping I get a nice, lighter, fluffier crumb at the end of the day. But this recipe that I have shared with you works really well. It gives you good bread. Friends and family will enjoy it, and you have a wonderful artisan bread that has this mild ginger flavor. It's absolutely delicious and unique and different. And if you're going to be using the turmeric one, also will continue with that light turmeric flavor. If you have any questions with regards to this recipe or any suggestions on how to make my bread lighter and fluffier, please feel free to share them, and I will definitely try them in an experiment in an upcoming video. And if you have any more questions to do with ginger bugs, so go check out those videos I've supplied on how to make a ginger bug, how to split a ginger bug for a cheat bug and make it mature faster, and how to use your ginger bug to make wild sodas, amongst many things. Then go ahead and do that. I'm also going to be creating an upcoming video on how to use your ginger bug to make a homemade fruit wine, because that is why I have this bug. It is the one yeast you can do to solve almost all your yeast needs in the home, from needing to make wild sodas, making home beverages like fruit wines, and to even baking bread. And that is why I have ginger and turmeric bugs at home. So until next time, guys, thank you so much for joining me. And please feel free to support this podcast. You can buy me a coffee and support me while I do my late night ferments and baking in the kitchen. I will leave the link to that below. Otherwise, pop into my store and see if there's anything there that interests you. I am going to be launching a range of gingerbug starters that you would be able to purchase in my online store, so check those down below. And thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay cultured and stay bubbling.